You're standing on the porch of a log cabin in the middle of the night. The Mississippi River is a few hundred feet away, calm, dark, ordinary. Then the ground beneath your feet starts to roll, like water instead of earth. The river itself begins to run backward. And by morning, a piece of America you thought was solid ground has changed shape forever. This isn't a story about California. It isn't about a fault line on a map you already know. It's about the middle of the continent, the part everyone assumes is safe. And it's about the night the Earth proved that assumption wrong. Start with a date. The 16th of December, 1811. A small frontier settlement called New Madrid, sitting along the Mississippi River in what is now Missouri. Just before sunrise, the ground convulsed with a force so violent that eyewitnesses described the earth rising and falling like ocean swells. Trees snapped. Chimneys collapsed for hundreds of miles in every direction. And this was only the beginning. Over the following months, the region was struck by not one earthquake, but a sequence of major shocks, now studied by seismologists as among the most powerful in recorded North American history. Here's the detail most people never learn in school. This wasn't a single quake. It was a swarm. 3 main shocks in December, January, and February, each estimated by modern researchers at the United States Geological Survey to have been strong enough to be felt across more than 1 million square miles. Church bells rang on their own in Boston. Furniture rattled in Washington, D.C. Sidewalks cracked in Charleston, South Carolina. A quake in the quiet farmland of Missouri Territory shook the entire eastern half of a nation that hadn't even fully mapped itself yet. One of the clearest accounts comes from Eliza Bryan, a resident of New Madrid who lived through the entire sequence and wrote a detailed letter describing what she witnessed, a letter historians still cite today as one of the few first-hand records of the disaster. She described a complete darkness caused by sulfurous vapor rising from the ground, the earth splitting open in long fissures that swallowed trees whole, and the terrifying sound of the ground itself, a roar she compared to distant thunder that never stopped. Explorer and naturalist John James Audubon, traveling through Kentucky at the time, later wrote about the ground moving beneath his horse so violently that the animal refused to walk, planting its legs wide and trembling until the shaking passed. Why here? Why the middle of a continent with no visible mountain range, no obvious plate boundary, nothing that looked dangerous at all? The answer lies buried far beneath the Mississippi River, in what geologists now call the New Madrid seismic zone. Unlike California, which sits directly on the boundary between 2 tectonic plates, this region sits deep inside one, in the middle of the North American plate itself. Seismologist Arch Johnston, who spent decades studying the zone at the Center for Earthquake Research and Information, helped establish that the danger here comes from an ancient buried rift, a scar in the Earth's crust, left over from a failed continental breakup hundreds of millions of years ago. The plate itself isn't splitting, but the old wound never fully healed, and stress still builds quietly along it, with nowhere obvious to release. That's the first theory historians and scientists point to. Ancient geology, not modern tectonics. A fault system that shouldn't be dangerous by the usual rules, behaving dangerously anyway. The second theory is about what the earthquakes actually did to the land, and it sounds almost impossible until you look at the evidence. The Mississippi River, one of the most powerful rivers on the planet, briefly reversed its own current. Waterfalls formed where the riverbed buckled upward. Whole islands vanished beneath the water. And in Tennessee, the ground sank so dramatically that the Mississippi River poured into the depression and created an entirely new lake, Reelfoot Lake, which still exists today, its drowned cypress trees still standing in the water more than 2 centuries later. A geological event, usually measured in centimeters of ground movement, redrew an actual river on the map. The third theory is quieter, and in some ways, more unsettling. It isn't about what happened in 1811. It's about what almost happened much more recently, and how close a modern panic came to becoming a self-fulfilling disaster. In 1990, a climatologist named Iben Browning, who held no formal seismology credentials, predicted a major New Madrid earthquake would strike on a specific date in December. His prediction spread through local news, then national news, then classrooms, until entire school districts across Missouri and Arkansas announced early closures for the day in question. Grocery store shelves emptied of bottled water and canned goods. Insurance companies reported a sudden spike in earthquake policy applications in a region that had barely thought about earthquakes in a generation. The United States Geological Survey and professional seismologists publicly stated the prediction had no scientific basis, that earthquakes cannot be predicted to a specific day, and convened a panel of experts specifically to say so on the record. The date came and went. Nothing happened, but the episode revealed something real, that a region most Americans had forgotten was capable of an earthquake at all could still trigger genuine, nationwide fear the moment someone suggested the ground might move again. Here's the twist that changes how you should think about all three of these threads. The New Madrid seismic zone hasn't gone quiet because the danger passed. It's gone quiet because the interval between major ruptures here is measured in centuries, not lifetimes. Researchers studying sediment layers along the river, a method called paleoseismology, have found evidence of similarly massive earthquake sequences roughly every 200 to 500 years, stretching back long before written history in the region. Scientists identify these older quakes through a phenomenon called liquefaction, where violent shaking turns saturated sand deep underground into something closer to liquid, forcing it upward through cracks to erupt at the surface in structures called sand blisters. Those buried sand deposits, some dating back centuries before New Madrid was ever founded, work almost like a geological fingerprint, letting researchers count past earthquakes the same way a tree's rings mark past years. The swarm of 1,811 and 1,812 wasn't a freak accident. It was this fault, doing what it has always done, on a clock too slow for any single human memory to track. Which means the real story isn't about a disaster from the past. It's about a disaster the region has simply not experienced again yet. Modern engineers take this seriously in ways most residents never notice. Building codes across parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky include seismic requirements most people assume only exist in California. Emergency planners run regional earthquake drills across the central United States precisely because the New Madrid zone sits beneath cities that were never built with an earthquake in mind, unlike the reinforced infrastructure of the American West. A modern repeat of 1,811 wouldn't just crack a few chimneys. It would strike bridges, pipelines, and power infrastructure built with the quiet assumption that the middle of the country would always stay still. Memphis, Tennessee sits almost directly within the zone's reach today, a metropolitan area of more than 1 million people built largely before modern seismic codes existed. Federal emergency planners have modeled scenarios where a repeat of the 1,811 sequence could damage transportation corridors that much of the country's freight and pipeline network depends on, since the region sits at the crossroads of interstate highways, rail lines, and river shipping that connect the eastern and western halves of the country. It's the kind of risk that rarely makes headlines, precisely because the last major rupture happened before photography existed to document it. And that's the modern echo worth sitting with. You've probably built your own quiet assumptions the same way. About the ground you stand on, literally or otherwise. About the stability of things you've simply never seen fail. The frontier families along the Mississippi in 1811 had no reason to expect the earth to move either until the night it did, and an entire river changed course to prove them wrong. You're standing on the porch of a log cabin in the middle of the night. The Mississippi River is a few hundred feet away. Calm, dark, ordinary. But you know now what that calm is actually hiding. And you understand, in a way you didn't before, why the ground beneath the safest looking places is sometimes the one worth questioning the most.